The plasma rifle hummed to life as Commander Zethkar adjusted the settings. Behind him, 3 billion beings across the galaxy watched through their neural feeds, their attention drawn by the emergency broadcast that had interrupted regular programming. The hegemony rarely made public displays of justice, but today was different. Today, they would show what happened to those who dared resist the natural order. The boy couldn't be more than 16 standard years. His dark hair hung in matted strands over defiant eyes that refused to show fear, even as the execution squad formed their line. His name was Marcus Chen, and according to the charges read moments before, he had committed the unthinkable crime of striking a hegemony official. Not just any official, but Sub-Commander Veltos himself, a member of the ruling Cytherian race. "Citizens of the hegemony," Zethkar's voice boomed across the broadcast network, his translation implants ensuring every species heard him in their native tongue. "Behold the fate of those who forget their place in the cosmic hierarchy. This human juvenile has violated the sacred order by raising his hand against his betters. Let his death serve as a reminder that some boundaries must never be crossed." The execution platform stood in the center of New Kepler's main plaza, a gleaming structure of metal and crystal that had witnessed countless such displays over the decades since humanity's subjugation. Massive holographic displays projected the scene to every corner of the city, while orbital transmitters carried the signal across the galaxy's communication networks. Marcus stood with his hands bound behind his back, his simple brown clothes torn and stained from his capture and imprisonment. The bruises on his face told the story of his interrogation, but his spine remained straight. Around the plaza, thousands of beings had gathered to witness the spectacle. Cytherians with their crystalline skin and towering frames stood in the places of honor, while humans and other subject species pressed together in the designated viewing areas, their faces masks of carefully controlled emotion. "Any last words, creature?" Zethkar asked, though his tone suggested he considered the question merely a formality. Marcus lifted his head, and for the first time since the broadcast began, he spoke. His voice was quiet, but the amplification systems carried it clearly across the plaza and beyond. "My name is Marcus Chen. I am 17 years old. I work in the hydroponics bays to support my sick mother and younger sister. Yesterday, I watched Sub-Commander Veltos execute my friend David for accidentally bumping into him in the corridor. David was 14. Marcus's voice grew steadier as he continued. "When Veltos laughed and called us vermin, I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't watch another friend die for nothing." A murmur rippled through the human sections of the crowd, quickly silenced by the presence of hegemony enforcers. Zethkar's mandibles clicked in annoyance. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. The condemned were meant to beg for mercy, to reinforce the power dynamic that kept the galaxy stable. "The boy confesses to his crime," Zethkar announced, trying to regain control of the narrative. "He struck a superior being and shows no remorse. The penalty is death, to be carried out immediately." But Marcus wasn't finished. "I want everyone watching to know something. We're not vermin. We're not insects to be crushed whenever you feel like it. We're human beings, and we have worth. My friend David had worth. Every person you've killed, every family you've destroyed, every dream you've crushed had worth." The execution squad raised their weapons, the familiar whine of charging plasma rifles filling the air. Zethkar held up one clawed hand, savoring the moment. This was why public executions were so effective. They broke the spirit of resistance before it could take root. Marcus looked directly into the nearest camera drone, his brown eyes blazing with conviction. "And I want every human watching to remember this moment. Remember that they killed a boy for standing up to a bully. Remember that they call it justice. Remember, and ask yourselves what you're going to do about it." "Enough!" Zethkar's roar echoed across the plaza. "Execute this insolent whelp!" The plasma bolts struck simultaneously, their blue-white energy tearing through Marcus Chen's chest. His body crumpled to the platform, smoke rising from the cauterized wounds. The boy who had dared to strike a Catherian was dead, his defiance silenced forever. Or so Commander Zethkar believed. He couldn't have known that in a small apartment overlooking the plaza, an 8-year-old girl named Sarah Chen had just watched her brother die on live broadcast. He couldn't have known that she was different from other humans, that her brain worked in ways that even she didn't fully understand yet. And he certainly couldn't have known that the quantum communication array he stood next to, the same array broadcasting his triumph across the galaxy, was about to become the instrument of his doom. Sarah's scream of anguish and rage tore through the apartment, a sound of such pain and fury that it seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the merely physical. Her small hands pressed against her temples as something deep within her mind awakened. Something that had been dormant until this moment of absolute devastation. The quantum array began to fluctuate. In the military command center orbiting New Kepler, senior analyst Threxmal noticed the first anomalies. The quantum field readings were spiking beyond anything he'd seen in his 30-year career, but the source was impossible to pinpoint. The fluctuations seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, as if space itself was being twisted by some unknown force. Commander Zethkar, Threxmal's voice crackled through the communication system. We're detecting massive quantum disturbances planet-side. Recommend immediate evacuation of the transmission cut to static. On the execution platform, Zethkar was still basking in the success of his broadcast when the air around him began to shimmer. The quantum array, a structure the size of a small building that served as the planet's primary communication hub, started to emit a low, thrumming sound that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the bones. The crowd began to murmur nervously, some of the more sensitive species backing away from the platform. The Catherians, with their enhanced sensory organs, were the first to feel it. A wrongness in the fabric of reality itself, as if something vast and terrible was pressing against the boundaries of normal space. "What's happening?" Veltos demanded, his crystalline features reflecting the strange lights that were beginning to dance around the quantum array. "Why are the systems malfunctioning?" Zethkar opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. The array erupted in a pillar of brilliant light that reached toward the sky like a spear thrust into the heart of heaven. The light wasn't the clean blue-white of plasma fire or the warm yellow of stellar radiation. It was something else entirely, something that hurt to look at and yet commanded attention. And then the screaming began. Not from the crowd, though many of them had fallen to their knees clutching their heads. The screaming came from the quantum field itself, a howl of tortured mathematics and twisted physics that every sentient being in the system could feel in their minds. It was the sound of space-time being forced into shapes it was never meant to hold, of natural laws being bent past their breaking point. The pillar of light pulsed once, twice, and then exploded outward in a wave of energy that washed over the entire planet. Where it touched, technology failed. The hovering camera drones fell from the sky like broken birds. The massive holographic displays flickered and died. The orbital communication satellites went silent one by one. Their quantum processors burned out by energies they couldn't comprehend. But the wave didn't stop at New Kepler. It raced outward through the quantum communication network that linked every world in the hegemony, a cascade of impossible energy riding the very infrastructure the Empire used to maintain control. System after system fell silent as the wave passed through them, but silence wasn't all it left behind. In the deeper layers of quantum space, where information and reality blurred together into something that might charitably be called mathematics, something else was spreading. A virus, but not of code or biology. A virus of pure concept, of weaponized idea, carried on waves of grief and rage that burned through the hegemony's networks like acid through flesh. The humans across the galaxy had watched a boy die for the crime of standing up to evil. They had seen his courage, heard his words, witnessed his defiance in the face of absolute power. And now, as their communication systems failed and darkness fell across their worlds, they began to understand that something had fundamentally changed. The hegemony had made a mistake. They had killed Marcus Chen in front of everyone, thinking it would break human resistance forever. Instead, they had created something far more dangerous than any rebellion or uprising. They had created a martyr. And martyrs, as any student of history could tell you, had a way of inspiring the most unexpected consequences. 8 minutes had passed since the execution. In those 8 minutes, the quantum wave had reached 73 different star systems. Communication networks were failing across the galaxy, and in a small apartment on New Kepler, an 8-year-old girl named Sarah Chen was learning what it meant to be something more than human. The hegemony's darkest hour had begun, though they didn't know it yet. They would learn soon enough that some things, once broken, could never be repaired. And sometimes, the breaking was exactly what needed to happen. The revolution hadn't begun with armies or weapons or grand declarations of war. It had begun with a little girl's scream of grief, and the quantum field's willingness to listen. What came next would reshape the galaxy forever. And the hegemony would discover that there were some prices too high to pay for maintaining order. Marcus Chen was dead. But his sister was very much alive, and she was angry. The universe was about to learn what human anger could accomplish when given the right tools. The quantum cascade reached the hegemony's capital world of Kitharos Prime exactly 14 minutes after Marcus Chen's execution. Grand Admiral Korathwin was in the middle of a strategy meeting when every communication device in the Imperial Palace simultaneously erupted in static, then fell silent. The massive holographic display that normally showed the status of their far-flung empire flickered once and went dark. "Technician!" Korathwin's voice echoed through the chamber, his crystalline skin shifting to angry crimson hues. "Restore communications immediately." But the chief technician, a nervous Altarian named Jix, could only stare at his instruments in bewilderment. "Sir, the quantum network appears to be gone. Not damaged, not jammed. Gone, as if it never existed." Across the galaxy, the same scene was playing out on thousands of worlds. The hegemony's greatest strength, their instantaneous communication network that allowed them to coordinate an empire spanning multiple galactic arms, had become their greatest weakness. The quantum virus Sarah Chen had unknowingly created didn't just destroy equipment, it fundamentally altered the mathematical constants that made faster-than-light communication possible in those regions. On New Kepler, the aftermath of the execution had descended into chaos. The massive crowd that had gathered to watch the display of hegemony power was now trapped in a city where nothing electronic functioned. Ground vehicles were dead. Communication devices were silent. Even the simple lighting systems had failed, plunging large sections of the city into darkness despite the midday sun. Commander Zethkar stood on the execution platform, his plasma rifle as useless as a metal club, staring at the now silent quantum array. The pillar of impossible light had faded, but the air around the structure still shimmered with residual energy that made his sensitive Cytherian eyes water. "Sir," one of his subordinates approached carefully. "What are your orders?" Zethkar had no answer. In his 3 decades of military service, he had never encountered anything like this. The closest comparison was the legendary human wars from 50 years ago, but even those conflicts had followed the predictable patterns of conventional warfare. This was something entirely different, an attack on the fundamental infrastructure of reality itself. What he couldn't know was that the real attack was only beginning. In her apartment, Sarah Chen had finally stopped screaming. The 8-year-old sat in the middle of her family's small living room, her dark eyes now holding depths that seemed far older than her years. Around her, the walls were covered with scorch marks in geometric patterns that hurt to look at. Mathematical equations burned into matter by forces that had no name. Her mother, Lin Chen, approached slowly. She had watched her son die from this same window, had felt her heart break as the plasma bolts struck him down. But now she was seeing something that terrified her even more than grief. Her daughter was changing. "Sarah?" Lin's voice was barely a whisper. "Sweetie, are you okay?" Sarah turned toward her mother, and Lin gasped. The child's eyes were no longer entirely brown. Flecks of silver light danced in them, moving in patterns that seemed to follow complex mathematical sequences. When Sarah spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated strangely in the small room. "They killed Marcus, Mama. They killed him because he stood up for David. They killed him because he said we had worth." Sarah's small hands clenched into fists. "But I can feel something. In the space between spaces. In the numbers that hold everything together." Lin didn't understand the words, but she understood the pain behind them. She knelt beside her daughter and pulled her into a gentle embrace, feeling the strange warmth that seemed to radiate from the child's skin. "I know, baby. I know it hurts. It's not just hurt, Mama." Sarah's voice was growing steadier, more focused. "I can see the patterns now, the way they control us. The way they use the quantum networks to watch us, to coordinate their fleets, to keep us separate and afraid. But the patterns can be changed." Across the city, similar conversations were taking place in thousands of human households. The execution had been broadcast to every screen, every neural feed, every communication device in human space. Children who had been forced to watch their people suffer for generations had seen Marcus Chen stand tall in the face of death and declare their worth. And some of those children, it turned out, were more than they appeared to be. The humans had been slaves for 50 years, ever since the hegemony's conquest. But slavery, as any historian knew, bred certain survival traits. The weak died quickly under such conditions. The strong adapted, and sometimes, very rarely, the pressure produced something entirely unexpected. Dr. Elena Vasquez was one of the first to recognize the pattern. A xenobiology researcher working in the university district, she had access to the old human databases that predated the conquest. When her communication equipment failed, she did what any good scientist would do. She started gathering data manually. The reports came in fragments, carried by runners moving through the darkened city. Children experiencing sudden neurological changes. Adults reporting strange dreams filled with mathematical imagery. But most significantly, technology failures that didn't follow any known pattern of electromagnetic or quantum interference. "It's as if the laws of physics are being rewritten locally," she muttered to herself, reviewing her handwritten notes by candlelight. "But that's impossible. The quantum constants are universal. They can't just change because—" She stopped, her pen hovering over the paper. "Unless they're not natural constants at all." The thought was too enormous to grasp fully, but pieces of a larger picture were beginning to emerge. The hegemony's technology was based on quantum manipulation, just like humanity's had been before the conquest. But human quantum theory had always been purely mathematical, limited by their understanding of the universe. What if that understanding had been incomplete? What if consciousness itself could influence quantum fields under the right circumstances? Meanwhile, in the depths of space, the hegemony was beginning to understand the scope of their crisis. Fleet Admiral Tyson commanded the 3rd Stellar Navy, a force of 12,000 warships responsible for maintaining order in the Outer Rim territories. When the quantum cascade reached his flagship, every ship in his fleet was suddenly isolated, unable to communicate even with vessels a few kilometers away. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving emergency beacons from multiple sectors. It appears the entire communication network has failed simultaneously." Thyson's mandibles clicked nervously. "Begin moving the fleet to predetermined rally points. We'll coordinate using laser communication and standard radio frequencies." But as the hours passed, it became clear that the problem was far worse than a simple communication failure. Ships that attempted to enter hyperspace found themselves unable to engage their faster-than-light drives. The quantum field equations that governed interstellar travel had somehow become unstable in entire regions of space, creating navigation hazards that even the hegemony's best pilots couldn't overcome. Reports began filtering in from across the Empire. Entire star systems had gone dark. Supply lines were severed. Garrison forces found themselves cut off from reinforcement or resupply. And strangest of all, human populations that had been passive and cooperative for decades were beginning to show signs of organized resistance. On the world of Proxima Tertius, human workers in the orbital manufacturing platforms had somehow gained access to the station's security systems, locking out hegemony overseers and demanding better working conditions. On Kepler 442, human farmers had disappeared into the wilderness, taking with them advanced agricultural equipment that should have been impossible to operate without hegemony authorization codes. But the most disturbing reports came from the research stations. Human scientists, many of whom had been working on classified hegemony projects, were vanishing along with critical data and equipment. It was as if 50 years of enforced cooperation had suddenly dissolved, replaced by a coordinated rebellion that spanned multiple star systems. Grand Admiral Koreth Wynn studied the fragmentary reports coming in from his scattered forces, his crystalline features shifting through worried color patterns. The hegemony had ruled the galaxy for over 3 centuries, crushing dozens of species and incorporating them into their empire. They had protocols for dealing with rebellions, procedures for handling communication disruptions, contingencies for every conceivable military scenario. But they had no protocols for dealing with an enemy that could apparently rewrite the fundamental laws of physics. "Sir," his aide approached cautiously, "we've received a priority message from the Quantum Research Division. It was transmitted by courier ship, as normal communication channels remain unavailable." Korethwin accepted the data tablet, his claws clicking against its surface as he scrolled through the report. What he read made his blood run cold. The quantum cascade wasn't random. Analysis of the propagation pattern showed clear signs of intelligent design, as if someone or something had deliberately chosen which systems to target and which to leave functional. Moreover, the areas of quantum instability were showing signs of active manipulation. The damaged field equations were being continuously modified, preventing any attempt at repair. "Impossible," he whispered. "No species in the galaxy has this level of quantum manipulation capability. Our own scientists have been working on field control theory for centuries without achieving anything close to this level of precision." But even as he spoke, Korethwin knew he was wrong. There was one species that had shown unusual aptitude for quantum mechanics before their conquest. One species that had developed faster-than-light communication and travel independently, using mathematical approaches that differed significantly from standard hegemony methods. The humans. For 50 years, the hegemony had assumed that humanity's unusual technological development was simply the result of their chaotic, individualistic society. They had systematically dismantled human research institutions, scattered their scientists, and destroyed their technological base to prevent any possibility of renewed resistance. But what if they had made a crucial error? What if humanity's quantum theories weren't just different, but fundamentally superior? What if 50 years of oppression had created evolutionary pressure that produced individuals capable of directly interfacing with quantum fields. The Grand Admiral's aide noticed the color patterns shifting across his superior's skin, deep purple hues that indicated profound concern. "Sir? Your orders?" Corethwin set down the data tablet and moved to the great viewing port that looked out over the capital city of Kitharos Prime. Somewhere in the depths of space, human beings who should have been crushed and broken were somehow striking back at an empire that had considered them inferior. They were using weapons and techniques that challenged everything the hegemony thought they knew about physics and warfare. "Send word to all available fleets," he said finally. "Implement Protocol Omega. Every human world is to be considered a potential threat. Begin immediate evacuation of all hegemony personnel from systems with significant human populations." The aide's color patterns showed confusion. "Sir, Protocol Omega requires proof of existential threat to the Empire. Surely a communication disruption doesn't warrant—" "This isn't a communication disruption." Corethwin turned back to his subordinate, his eyes blazing with certainty. "This is the opening move in a war unlike anything we've ever faced. The humans are no longer content to be slaves, and it appears they've developed capabilities we never imagined possible." As if to emphasize his point, the lights in the chamber flickered, and for a brief moment, the air itself seemed to shimmer with the same impossible energies that had surrounded the quantum array on New Kepler. Somewhere in the galaxy, Sarah Chen was learning to control her newfound abilities, and she was teaching others to do the same. The hegemony's empire was about to discover that some chains, when broken, could never be reforged, and sometimes the very act of trying to enslave a species only made them stronger in ways their oppressors could never anticipate. Marcus Chen had died to spark a revolution. His sister was about to finish what he started. 3 days after Marcus Chen's execution, the hegemony discovered that their empire was burning. Not with conventional fire, that would have been manageable. Instead, it burned with something far more devastating: the spreading realization among their subject species that their overlords were not invincible. The quantum cascade had done more than destroy communication networks. It had shattered the illusion of hegemony supremacy that had kept the galaxy in line for centuries. Sarah Chen stood in what had once been New Kepler's primary administrative complex, her small form dwarfed by the massive chamber where hegemony officials had once ruled over millions of human lives. The 8-year-old girl looked nothing like the broken child who had watched her brother die. The silver light in her eyes had spread, creating intricate patterns that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. When she spoke, the air itself seemed to vibrate with her words. "Can you feel it, Dr. Vasquez?" Sarah asked without turning around. Behind her, the xenobiologist emerged from the shadows, her face a mixture of awe and terror. "The way the numbers sing when they're free?" Elena Vasquez had been documenting the changes spreading through the human population for 3 days now. What she had discovered challenged every assumption she had made about the nature of consciousness and reality. Children across the city were manifesting abilities that seemed to directly violate known physics. Adults were reporting shared dreams filled with mathematical concepts they had never studied. And at the center of it all was this impossible child who spoke of quantum fields as if they were living things. "Sarah," Elena said carefully, "what happened to you when Marcus died? What did you do to the quantum array?" The girl finally turned, and Elena had to suppress a gasp. The child's features were still recognizably human, but there was something else there now, an alien intelligence that seemed to look through her eyes rather than from them. "I screamed," Sarah said simply. "But the scream went deeper than sound. It went into the spaces between atoms, into the probability clouds that hold reality together." And the universe screamed back. Elena pulled out her notebook, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote. She was documenting the birth of something unprecedented. perhaps a new stage in human evolution, perhaps something else entirely. And now? What are you doing now? Sarah smiled, and the expression was both childlike and ancient. I'm teaching others to scream, in the right frequency, in the right mathematical harmony. The hegemony uses quantum fields to control us, but they never understood that consciousness isn't just an observer of quantum mechanics. It's a participant. Across the galaxy, the effects of that participation were becoming impossible to ignore. On Tau Ceti 7, a hegemony garrison of 10,000 troops had been forced to retreat to their orbital platforms after their ground-based equipment began malfunctioning in patterns that followed no known physical laws. The human population, which had been subjugated for over 40 years, was somehow coordinating resistance efforts without any visible communication infrastructure. Fleet Admiral Thyssen studied the tactical reports with growing unease. His Third Stellar Navy had managed to regroup using conventional technology, but every attempt to engage human settlements had ended in disaster. Ships would approach a planet only to find their quantum drives failing at precisely the wrong moments, stranding them in orbit while human forces, armed with weapons they shouldn't have been able to operate, picked them apart with startling efficiency. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "we've lost contact with the 4th and 7th Fleets entirely. Last known positions were in the Proxima and Wolf systems." "Lost contact how?" Thyssen demanded. "Equipment failure? Enemy action?" "Unknown, sir. The ship simply stopped responding. Long-range scans show they're still in position, but they're not moving or communicating." What the tactical officer couldn't report, because no one yet understood what had happened, was that the crews of those fleets were still alive, but fundamentally changed. Human resistance fighters had somehow learned to project the same quantum field manipulations that Sarah Chen had discovered, and they were using them not to destroy their enemies but to convert them. Commander Zethkar experienced the conversion firsthand when human resistance forces finally reached the execution plaza on New Kepler. He had been expecting a conventional attack, armed militants storming the platform with stolen weapons. Instead, a small group of children approached the hegemony position, walking calmly through the defensive barriers as if they weren't there. "Halt!" Zethkar commanded, raising his sidearm. "Stay back or I'll fire!" The children didn't stop. They didn't even seem to notice the weapons pointed at them. Instead, they began to hum, a low, harmonious sound that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones. As they hummed, the air around them began to shimmer with the same impossible energies that had surrounded the quantum array. Zethkar pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. His weapon's plasma cell was fully charged, its targeting systems operational, but the trigger mechanism simply wouldn't respond. Around him, his soldiers were experiencing the same phenomenon. Their equipment functioned perfectly until the moment they tried to use it against the approaching children. "What are you?" he whispered as the humming grew louder. The lead child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, looked up at him with eyes that held the same silver light as Sarah Chen's. "We're what you made us," he said quietly. 50 years of oppression. 50 years of telling us we were worthless. 50 years of forcing us to adapt or die." The child stepped closer, and Zethkar found himself unable to move. "Did you really think we would just break? Did you think human beings wouldn't find a way to fight back?" The humming reached a crescendo, and suddenly, Zethkar could see them, the quantum threads that connected every atom, every thought, every possibility in the universe. They were beautiful and terrible, a vast web of cause and effect that stretched across space and time. And he could see how the hegemony had used those threads, how they had twisted them to maintain their empire of fear and control. But he could also see how the humans had learned to sing to those same threads, to harmonize with the fundamental frequency of existence itself. They weren't destroying the quantum infrastructure. They were liberating it, freeing it from the artificial constraints that had allowed the hegemony to maintain their technological advantage. "You feel it now, don't you?" the child said. And Zethkar realized with shock that he was no longer speaking aloud. The words appeared directly in his mind, carried on quantum fluctuations that bypassed normal sensory channels. "You feel how wrong it all was, how much pain you caused, how much potential you wasted." Zethkar's mind reeled as he experienced 50 years of human suffering from the perspective of the victims. Every execution, every act of casual cruelty, every moment of deliberate humiliation played out in his consciousness with perfect clarity. But worse than the pain was the waste, the brilliant minds forced into manual labor, the artists reduced to factory workers, the children who died young because they dared to dream of something better. "Why?" he gasped, falling to his knees. "Why show me this?" "Because you're going to help us," another child said. This one a girl with intricate quantum light patterns dancing across her skin. "You're going to help us free everyone, the Catherians, the Altarians, all the species that serve the hegemony out of fear. You're going to help us show them that there's a better way." On Kitharos Prime, Grand Admiral Korethwin was coming to understand that his empire faced something unprecedented in galactic history. The reports arriving by courier ship painted a picture of systematic collapse across multiple sectors. Not military defeat. The hegemony still had superior numbers and firepower. Instead, they were facing something far more dangerous: the complete breakdown of the ideological foundations that held their empire together. Species that had been conquered centuries ago were remembering their own cultures, their own technologies, their own reasons for resisting. The quantum virus that had started on New Kepler wasn't just disrupting communication networks, it was disrupting the cultural programming that kept subject populations docile and cooperative. "Sir," his aide reported, "we've received confirmation from the Inner Rim. The rebellion is spreading to non-human populations. The Zentaurians have declared independence. The Vegan colonies are in open revolt. Even some of our own Cytherian worlds are questioning their loyalty to the central government." Korethwin studied the galactic map, watching as more and more systems changed from green to red. The empire his ancestors had spent centuries building was dissolving in a matter of days, and at the center of it all were the humans, the species they had considered primitive and easily controlled. "What do our quantum theorists say about the field manipulations?" he asked. "They're baffled, sir. The mathematical models suggest that what the humans are doing should be impossible. Conscious manipulation of quantum fields requires computational resources that exceed anything we've ever developed. A single biological brain shouldn't be capable of the calculations involved." "Unless," Korethwin mused, "they're not doing the calculations. Unless they've found a way to interface directly with the quantum substrate without needing to understand it mathematically." It was a terrifying thought. The hegemony's entire technological advantage was based on their sophisticated understanding of quantum mechanics. If the humans had found a way to bypass that understanding entirely, to manipulate quantum fields through some form of direct consciousness interface, then every assumption about the nature of intelligence and technology would need to be reconsidered. On New Kepler, Sarah Chen stood in the center of the quantum array, her small hands resting on the crystalline structures that had once been tools of oppression. Around her, hundreds of humans and converted hegemony personnel worked together, using their newfound abilities to repair and rebuild the communication networks they had destroyed. But this time, the networks were different. Instead of carrying only authorized hegemony transmissions, they resonated with the voices of every sentient being who chose to connect with them. The quantum fields that had once been used to maintain control became a vast chorus of consciousness, linking minds across space in patterns of cooperation rather than domination. "Can you hear them all, Mama?" Sarah asked as her mother approached the platform. Lin Chen nodded, tears streaming down her face. She could indeed hear them, millions of voices singing together across the galaxy, sharing their stories, their pain, their hopes for a better future. Marcus's voice was there too, somehow preserved in the quantum echoes of his final moments, his words of defiance and courage rippling through the network like stones thrown into still water. "What happens now?" Lin asked. Sarah turned to her with the smile of a child who had seen the fundamental structure of reality and found it beautiful. "Now we teach them all to sing," she said. "Every species, every world, every consciousness that wants to be free. We show them that the universe isn't about dominance or control. It's about harmony." As if to demonstrate her point, the quantum array pulsed with warm, golden light, and every being connected to the network felt a moment of perfect understanding. They saw themselves as part of something vast and magnificent, not as subjects or rulers, but as participants in a cosmic symphony that had been waiting eons for them to learn how to play their parts. The hegemony's empire didn't fall in a day. The conversion took months, as quantum harmonics spread from system to system, consciousness to consciousness, transforming fear into understanding and oppression into cooperation. Some Cytherians fought against the change, clinging to their positions of power even as their worlds emptied around them, but most embraced it, discovering that freedom felt better than dominance ever had. Marcus Chen had died believing that his sacrifice would help his people remember their worth. He could never have imagined that his death would trigger an evolutionary leap that would transform not just humanity, but every sentient species in the galaxy. His sister had given them all the greatest gift imaginable, the ability to hear the music that had always been there, waiting for them to learn how to listen. In the end, the hegemony burned not with fire, but with the light of a billion minds, finally free to sing together. And in that light, something new was born. A galactic civilization based not on conquest and control, but on harmony and mutual understanding. The universe, it turned out, had been waiting for this moment all along. And Marcus Chen, in dying with dignity and courage, had lit the fuse that would finally set it free.